Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about urbanization. So I want to go over two things with you today. I want to go over the 6-7 reading guide, and I also want to go over a PowerPoint with you. So we'll do the reading guide first. First things first, I hope everybody's well at home. Hope you're ready for your quiz tomorrow on 6-6 and 6-7 on immigration and urbanization. So first term is the frontier thesis. In 1890, the United States Census took the frontier off of the census, meaning there is no more unexplored territory in the United States. And for some Americans, this was a moment of realization that our country had matured, that we had grown up, that there was no more undiscovered land out there. And this was written by a man named Frederick Jackson Turner. So that's one of the names here at the end, Frederick Jackson Turner. He was a history professor, and he wrote this thesis, and he delivered it at the 1893 World's Fair. Tenement housing. Tenement housing, as we'll see here in the PowerPoint, is poor urban housing that was created in cities across the country. The most famous, obviously, being New York City. And these are places with, where rooms were fairly decent size, but multiple families would live in one room. Restrooms would be communal. There might be two in one floor if you're lucky enough to have them inside. If not, you have to go to the outhouse. But this is where a lot of immigrants lived when they came here to the United States. They were dirty, they were crammed, they were many times disease infested because of the high population density, not well taken care of. The political machine in cities across the country, and again, we'll focus on New York City here because New York City is not only the biggest city in the country, but it's the cultural capital, it's the financial capital, it's the number one destination for immigrants. But political machines were groups that were obviously in business to win elections. Could be Democrat, could be Republican. In New York City, Tammany Hall is the big example that they were a Democratic political machine. They're not really idealistic or ideological. It's more about power and maintaining authority. They really enjoyed, obviously, the idea of immigration because immigrants were voters, and immigrants are going to be voters once they become citizens. And so they would, take care of people coming here to this country. They'd take care of the poor and the needy. If somebody loses a job, they might help provide them with some food, some money to help them get by. Thanksgiving time, poor people, they give turkeys out. They help people, in various capacities. But in return, they expected to get your vote, and they also were involved in graft and corruption. For instance, let's say that you have control over a construction company. You're a political boss, like Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed being one of the vocab terms. He's the most famous example of excess with these political machines. They would get construction contracts, and maybe it's the city that wants you to construct something, a bridge or a building or whatever. And you say that it costs $30 million. In reality, it only costs $15 million, but you're going to use the extra money that you charge the city to pass out to your political friends and to help yourself out and to enrich yourself at public expense. So this was happening across the country at the city level. This is during the Gilded Age. Now, this does carry into the 1900s. However, in the early 1900s, as we'll see in the next unit in the Progressive Era, one of the big movements is to get rid of corruption like this because it's too much for people. They're saying that, yes, these political bosses and these political machines do help people out, but they also help them out at a very high expense. Taxes were higher because these men would, require more government money to fund their habits. At this time, there is a movement to kind of clean up politics a little bit because if you remember going way back to the 1820s, when Andrew Jackson won the election, they had what they call the spoils system, where you give your political operatives or people that helped you win the election, you give them cushy government jobs. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a family member, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's the child of a friend, and they might not be really well qualified, but because they have the right name, because they're connected to you, you give them a cushy job. Well, in 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act. We're going down your list here for your vocab. And the Pendleton Civil Service Act is kind of the death blow to the spoils system. This says if you're going to get government jobs, you have to take a civil service test, and you have to show that you're competent and qualified for these positions. Not every government job requires taking the civil service test, but a majority of them, because the Pendleton Civil Service Act did, which means you have more, I shouldn't say intelligent, but more capable people running your government. At the bottom of the last term is the social gospel. So there's a movement in the 1880s, 1890s we've talked about social Darwinism. We've talked about, rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, people feeling lost in the shuffle of society with the urbanization and things of that nature. Well, the social gospel movement seeks to kind of in, interject Christianity into politics and into people's ways of life. So what we're doing here with the social gospel movement is you have philanthropists, middle, upper class people who are trying to reach out to the poor and try to make their lives better in many ways through things like settlement houses, trying to show people a better way of life, Americanize them, and that would be part of the social gospel movement. And they do it oftentimes in the name of Christianity, hence the term gospel. The only other name that we didn't go over here, we're going to skip the questions because I presume that you read, and I assume that you did these questions well because we have our quiz tomorrow, so I'm not going to bore you with the details. But going to the last name here, Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was one of the first photojournalists in our country's history. He was an immigrant from Denmark, and he came to our country not necessarily with an agenda or an ideology, but as he's obviously working his way up the economic and social ladder of our country, he realizes that people from immigrant backgrounds have sometimes horrible lives that need documented, and their stories are worth being told, as well as people who are wildly successful. So we're going to see here in our PowerPoint that he put out a book in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives, and it documented the lives of immigrants in these tenement houses. And he had a wide following, including the mayor of New York, the police commissioner of New York at the time, a man you may have heard of. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt, as police commissioner, would walk the streets at night of New York City, sometimes with Jacob Riis, to really get a feel for what the urban poor were going through. And these experiences with Theodore Roosevelt are going to resonate with him. And when he's the president of the United States, he's going to bring a different attitude to the White House when it comes to the working poor. Now I'd like to get to the PowerPoint. So there's different numbers depending on the sources that you read. So I'm not going to test you on things like numbers. When I say like urban population 1870, 10 million, 1920, 54 million, I'm not going to make you memorize these numbers, but what do you see? You see this huge jump in the number of people living in urban areas in this country. You see, in this case, it's, gone up fivefold or 5.5-fold just in the 50-year period. When it comes to urbanization, we're not just talking about people coming from Europe. Yesterday, we talked about 33 million people coming to the United States during this period. Well, there's also people coming to cities that are from America's farmland. When you think about it, about 1900, one laborer on a farm could do what it took 18 laborers to do 30 years prior. But we talked about the gasoline-powered tractor, just innovations in mechanization on farms. So you didn't need as much labor on the farms anymore as you used to. So a lot of these, farmers' sons, farmers' daughters that weren't able to make it on the old family farm the way that they used to, were having to go somewhere else to make a livelihood. So these people were also going to cities. And consequentially, also, the birth rate goes down. American farmers and American urban workers are having fewer children because there's not a necessity for the labor the way that there once was. Also, besides the immigrants, you have African Americans. At this time, you have roughly 500,000 African Americans from the South moving north. In the 1880s and 1890s, you start to see Jim Crow laws being passed in the South. Since the Reconstruction is over, you have people leaving the South in greater numbers because voting rights are being taken away, political rights, of all kinds are being taken away. There's no federal government in the South anymore to look out for the rights of poor whites and African Americans. So blacks feel particularly threatened, obviously, so they're moving north for factory jobs. In the North this time, black men are treated and women are treated much better than in the South. They prefer the North. However, it's not perfect. There's still something called de facto segregation, which we'll talk about another time. All right, this is a picture that you see here. This is Greenwich Village around 1890. When you see the C, it says C 1890. That C stands for circa. That's approximately or about. With a lot of these photos, they're not well documented the way we would do them today. Like everything you take now, every picture you take on your phone now has a timestamp. So back then, people would take pictures, and they wouldn't always necessarily have the exact date on them. So we're saying approximately 1890, New York City. So if you look at this picture, if we were in class, we'd be saying, okay, what do you see in this picture? So you see people from various backgrounds. I mean, you can see this guy here with a big mustache. You would assume, based on the way he's dressed, based on the way that he looks, that he's an immigrant, based on the way that it looks like his daughter is dressed. You see fresh produce here. You see wagons drawn by horses walking the streets. You see a very high population density. New York's Lower East Side at this time is the most densely populated area of the entire world. You see these buildings here getting taller. They're getting taller because of structural steel, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. You see people walking around, with baskets, and they're coming both directions. You see kids out who are unaccompanied. There's all kinds of people. Everybody here has a story to tell. These people came from various different countries in Europe, it looks like from this picture, and everybody here is hoping to make it in the new world. Urbanization. So immigrants move to cities. They're close to factory jobs where a majority of immigrants are going to work. There are large pockets of immigrants already there. We discussed in class that if you're an immigrant, you're looking for people like you of a common background so that you can speak your language, have your culture, your customs, your religious services, and ease into America in a comfortable fashion. Also, the city centers are vacated by upper and middle classes. If you're living in America in 1860 and you're a factory owner, or if you're a manager, you live right downtown, right near your factory, and your workers live around you. But because of innovations in transportation, like L trains or elevated trains, so we know what subways are. Subways are trains beneath the ground. But this time, right before subways, you have elevated trains, which you still see in cities like Chicago, where the trains are above the streets and they go through the city. It's like a subway above the ground. But people are able to travel farther, faster for work. So you can move to places like the outskirts of the city or even suburbs of cities, which are starting to develop here in 1880s and 1890s. You got electric trolley cars. No cars yet. That's going to be coming very late 1800s, early 1900s, but only for the wealthy. Problems. You have tenement housing. Tenement housing, you can see from this picture here, tenements, very poor, unsanitary conditions. Nobody wants to live in a house or a neighborhood like this. I mean, you can see the streets here are dirty. You see the kids. They're playing at, this is their playground right here. They look dirty from what I can tell. The houses look like, even though they're relatively new, they already look like they're dilapidated. They don't look like very clean, safe, fun, uplifting places to live. And because these houses are near the factories, it's smoggy, it's dirty. Like if you live in Pittsburgh, for instance, even if you go out 11 o'clock in the morning at noon, it looks like it's dusk all day long because of all the factory smoke and all the smog and the pollution. There's poor sanitation. Oftentimes, because most of these houses here wouldn't have had indoor plumbing, flush toilets weren't really becoming common in cities until after 1900. And even then, if you're living in rural areas of our country, you don't have indoor plumbing maybe till 1940s, 1950s. But anyway, very poor sanitation, bad drinking water. Oftentimes, the outhouse was right next to the well, the supply of drinking water, and the water could sometimes cross, and people could drink contaminated, disgusting water and get sick because of it. There's overcrowding in the cities with a high population density. I mean, think about it. We're living during a pandemic right now. They encourage you to spread out because the more tightly packed you are, the quicker disease spreads. So people, they'll get cholera, they'll get, different types of diseases, and they'll pass them on to each other. And people's immune systems would be weaker because they're not getting great food, they're not getting quality drinking water, they're not getting good medicine. So living in these cities, your life expectancy is not going to be the same as if you live in nicer areas. A lot of these homes are subject to fire. We talked about before, homes this time period, 1860s, 1870s, built out of wood. As time moves on, they're going to be built with better quality products, but for now, these are fire hazards. So we talk about settlement houses appearing to relieve the urban poor. Jane Addams in 1889 with Hull House was the first to create these settlement houses to try to give immigrants access to education, books, classes to teach them how to kind of fit in with the new society that they're living in and not to kind of be thrown to the wolves. Here's a very famous picture. This is from the book How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis that we already talked about. This is a tenement house. So you can see here, this is one room. There's multiple people. There's a guy sleeping here, in the back, here. This is one room. These are immigrants. A lot of times in these tenement houses, people would sleep in shifts. You have a 12-hour shift at the mill. Let's call it a steel plant. You have a 12-hour shift. When you come home, you get the tenement for 12 hours, and then or the bed. In this case, it might be this lovely bed right here. This is your bed for 12 hours. Oh, there's another person there I didn't recognize. And then when you go to work, and there's other people getting off work and they're coming in, they take the bed right after you. So these places would obviously smell. It'd be dirty, very unsanitary. But this is how many immigrants lived. Not all, but at this time, if you're living in the cities, a majority of immigrants would live in this fashion. Another picture of a tenement house here, or housing development. You can see all the laundry being hung out to dry here in the cities. Another picture here, you got a lady with her little baby. You got 3 workers sitting out here, and just look how run down everything looks. I mean, this wouldn't be up to code by modern day standards. If you had code inspectors walking in, these would be condemned buildings, many of these. All right, there are some good things happening at this time. I don't want to be harping on all the negatives. In 1883, one of an engineering marvel was finalized, the Brooklyn Bridge. This is the Brooklyn Bridge from today. It's still standing 137 years later. But they built this over a period of 13 years. 20 men died building this bridge. It was a mile long across the East River, and it connected New York City to Brooklyn. At this time, Brooklyn and New York City Manhattan are separate cities. At this time, Manhattan, New York City is annexing areas around them, and they are eventually going to annex Brooklyn. Brooklyn itself is one of the top 5 biggest cities in the country, and then when New York City takes it, it just becomes this mega city. But the Brooklyn Bridge was an engineering marvel of its time, and even to this day is considered to be pretty special. The first skyscraper in history was 1885, the Home Insurance Building in Chicago. What allows for these bridges and these skyscrapers to be erected is structural steel. Andrew Carnegie, again, using the Bessemer process to create, these engineering marvels, just the structure. But you have men who are now starting to think we need to build up. Cities themselves, there's only so much space to build. So you can only move sideways so long. Eventually you run out of room. So now you have to start building up. Originally, buildings they were built out of stone and brick. You could get about 4 or 5 stories out of stone and brick before the weight couldn't support itself anymore. And they're starting to use iron for structures, and you can get up to maybe 10 stories. But then now with steel, Home Insurance Building, roughly 15 stories tall. By the early 1900s, you got buildings that are 30 stories tall. And then by the 1920s, 1930s, you have buildings like the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building that are being built that are, beyond what anybody could have ever conceived. The Flatiron Building, New York City, is another example of a skyscraper from this time period. Even by modern standards, like the architecture is pretty cool. It's pretty unique. I mean, you don't see many buildings like this. All right, and to show you the differences in the landscape or the cityscapes of the major cities of this time, this is a postcard from New York, circa 1860, approximately 1860. So on the eve of the Civil War, this is Manhattan. So you can see the harbor down here. No Statue of Liberty yet. No Ellis Island. No skyscrapers. This looks like a small town by modern standards. By 1890, this is what New York City looks like. You can see here the Brooklyn Bridge in the background. You can see the buildings are getting taller. And on the buildings, you're starting to see things like advertising. Advertising is huge business at this time because there's so many new products coming out that people need to be made aware of what they need. Because, again, we don't know that we need something until we see it advertised. So the advertising is different. The urban sprawl, you can see these buildings are taller, much more complex. And then by 1900, approximately 1900, you start to see the buildings really spring up. And this is looking more like a modern city that you would recognize today. Pittsburgh in 1860, again, here's a postcard. This would be on the eve of the Civil War. You can see there's a few bridges in Pittsburgh. By the way, Pittsburgh has more bridges than any city in the world. You can see the steamships here. This would be the Point down here. If you're looking here down in this region now, would be the University of Pittsburgh. Across the river here, this would be like where Heinz Field is, and in PNC Park where the Pirates lose games regularly. But you can see some industry, you can see some smokestacks. It's a city of its time. It's growing, but then by about 1900, you can see this is what Pittsburgh looks like. This is the Point. This is the downtown area, which now there's bigger skyscrapers here, but at the time there's more mill and factory jobs. Across the river here would be where the Heinz Field is, PNC Park. You can see more bridges are being developed here. Now there's bridges all the way across here, all the way through. But the cities themselves are growing by leaps and bounds. Urbanization, you got immigrants coming in, you got people from the South, African Americans, you got people from farmlands, you got all this change in machinery, you have all this change in technology like steel. Cities are growing leaps and bounds. America is changing rapidly, and some people are feeling like they aren't able to keep up with it. Well, that's all I have for urbanization. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that you found this intellectually stimulating. I hope you guys have a great day. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.